whether you're on one end of the spectrum and you're sort of paleo or carnivore, and you're the other end of the spectrum, plant-based. Interesting to me is that both of those groups can really agree that factory farming isn't something that is desirable, right, for the animal, for the planet. Maybe that's where the fake meats help out in terms of some of the fast food. But if we look at the adverse impacts of industrialization of farming, which really seems to be where a lot of things pivoted, with a lot of the adverse impacts on animal welfare and the planet. And of course, we need to feed a lot of people on the planet. This is obviously a broad area. What about if we start with the claims about water with animals? It's often stated that about 1 kilogram of beef consumes over 15,000 liters of water. Is that accurate? Are there some nuances there that we should be taking into consideration?
Yeah, so that's a great point, that the water use really depends on the type of water. And what is pretty clear is that in a natural environment of a rangeland or grassland, there's a certain amount of rainfall that comes naturally on that ground. And if you include that water, which is often included in these assessments of water use, that water is going to be there regardless of if you have cattle on the land or not. And so
it's going to rain. Doesn't matter what's on that land.
It's going to rain. Yeah. And in fact, when you look at the difference in water retention from a farm, like a monoculture, where it's tilled regularly versus some sort of regenerative, diverse production where you have cattle grazing on that land, or you have sometimes upwards of 100 species of grasses, forbs, legumes, you can actually increase the water absorption capacity of that soil. So you're actually storing more of the water, and then the cattle are consuming it. So in general, I think the claims are overstated on the water side. When you look at the actual type of water that's going to be used, really what we should be looking at is what water are we taking from sources that would otherwise need to be used for drinking water. So groundwater, et cetera. That it's the rainwater in the context of a pastured system is not going to be something that's going to be a negative impact, because that's part of the natural ecosystem. So I think that's key. And you bring up the good point about water. Other plant-based foods can take a lot of water. You think about nuts. Most of the nut production, almonds, et cetera, come from California, where there actually is a lot of water scarcity. And so just going plant-based for, say, a metric like water use would not be particularly smart, because a lot of crops take a lot of water to produce.
Yeah, I think that region in California, where they have the majority of the almond farms, is actually the most impacted from that lack of water. So that is interesting that there's layers to this. And the next argument that we often hear is that animal feed competes with the crops that would otherwise be, suitable for a human diet. And so we're feeding about 6 to 20 kilograms of grain to produce a kilogram of meat. Is that accurate, or what are some of the nuances there?
There's probably a case for making that claim, but it's a bit more nuanced than that. So for starters, you don't just consume one food like a grain, for example. And so if you just replace meat with a grain, you're not just going to consume that. You need to consume a diet that's balanced and meets your nutrition requirements.
Mm-hmm.
If you're growing crops for livestock feed directly, that is not an efficient use of land, because you can, in general, if you're feeding the crops that would otherwise go to humans, you would need more land to be able to produce that. You would need more ultimate food. But what people don't perhaps recognize is that most of the diet, especially for ruminants, comes from inedible foods. So this is the
stuff that we can't eat.
Yeah, this is the residues, the crop residues. So after a harvest of soybeans or corn, the cattle can graze and eat the leftovers that we can't eat. They eat most of their diet. If you look at ruminants, it's actually grasses and other foods that we can't eat. So this is roaming around on natural grasslands that oftentimes aren't suitable for crop production anyways. A lot of the Earth's surface is covered in rangelands. There's a lot of reasons why that can't be produced. The soil isn't fertile enough. Maybe it's too steep or too rocky.
Mm-hmm.
But livestock can actually graze that land. So when you look at it from the human food feed competition, I think there is a lot of livestock that could be produced in much more sustainable ways. And I think, like you're saying, the factory farming, where you sort of have a monoculture that's producing the feed, and then you're feeding that to livestock, is not an efficient process. And there's a lot of harmful consequences to that. But what it doesn't mean is that we can't produce livestock in sustainable ways. I think there's certainly ways to produce it, integrating livestock into these regenerative type production, having circular approaches.
Yeah, I mean, a few things that jumped out for me from your paper was, only 5% of the global feed intake consists of grains and soybean meal that would be in direct competition for the human diet. So that's not a lot, obviously. And the fact that ruminants need less protein from human edible feed, what is it, like zero point 0.6 kilograms, than what they deliver as 1 kilogram of that high quality protein is a pretty important metric, isn't it? When we're talking about how do we provide nutrient dense, lower energy foods to the population whilst contributing to, this healthy ecosystem, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So you're right. Like when you could think about the actual amount of food competing for human resources for ruminants, it's about 5%, even potentially less than that. And so most of their diet is largely inedible, and they're really efficient. They're ruminants for a reason, right? They can ferment that material into really nutrient.
Yeah, being able to take advantage of that upcycling seems like a benefit that hopefully we should still be able to harness. And what about the flip side when we think about just monocrops in general? I mean, if we're growing large single crops of vegetables, what are the potential pitfalls there for diversity? Because sometimes we just default to this heuristic of if we just have plants, well, then we're just going to have more, diversity as a result of that.
Yeah, I think it's important to recognize that all food production has an impact on the environment, and there are better and worse ways to produce food. So if our replacement of animal source foods comes from an industrial intensive monoculture, that may be efficient. And in the short term, in providing a lot of fossil fuel derived inputs can create high yields and on a low amount of land. But of course, there's nutrient pollution, there's runoff into waterways. There's a destruction of the ecosystem of that land where the crops are produced. So there's not much life on that land. A lot of animals can be actually harmed in that process through pesticides, through tilling, et cetera. The soil health diversity is really low. So that's sort of a case for industrial type farming. Oftentimes can be problematic, whether it's for crops or for livestock. But that doesn't also, of course, it doesn't mean that there aren't sustainable ways to produce plant source foods and crops, and there certainly are. And I think there is. Yeah. When you look at diverse, agro-ecosystems that combine a lot of different species of crops, and they can have the biodiversity increased on the land itself. They can actually be a place for birds to come. You can integrate into livestock systems, fruit trees. You can have these what are kind of called agroforestry. So there are these potential pathways to do this. It doesn't mean that everybody needs to eat animal source foods, but what it means is that there are actually sustainable ways to produce at least a moderate amount of animal source foods. Now, I think the big debate probably comes over how much can we sustainably produce and where and which types of food and what production methods, because there is a concern, animal source foods can take a lot of land. They can be problematic if they're not done properly and in balance. And that's sort of where I think the future direction of research should go, is to try to quantify in different contexts. Really, the local context should be key. That's cultural, that's ecological context. What types of foods can be produced and in what ways?
Yeah, it does become frustrating when we think about just the food waste, especially when it comes to the amount of inputs required to produce animal foods. And then as we're talking about, there is a cost to that. And then the food waste being so astronomically high around the world that even just, I don't know if it was Nigel Bloom or another doc or researcher talking about how we could, just that alone would really move the needle quite a bit. If we talk about the last, there's many more, but if we talk about a third component here around the environment, which is greenhouse gas emissions, that's another one that often gets cited by various on social media and media at different outlets. How much does our diet contribute to greenhouse gas emissions as compared to, housing, transportation, the stuff that we buy, the technology in our pockets, and even within diet, how does that sort of break down? Could you walk us through what you guys outline in the paper?
Yeah, so I think in the paper we're cautious to not say that greenhouse gas emissions from food production don't matter, because they do.
For sure.
And there is an impact, of course, and ruminants belch methane, and that contributes to our sort of what we consider anthropogenic emissions, the human caused emissions. There's a few points that we make. One is that if you have a natural ecosystem that's functioning properly, and every ecosystem includes plants and animals and whatnot. So if you have a rangeland where you would often where there are typically grasslands of cattle grazing, there are going to be wild ruminants on that land. There are going to be deer. Prehistorically there were larger megafauna, And things like termites actually generate a lot of methane. So there is some base level of methane when you think about just natural, grasslands or ecosystems that would function. So we want to look more holistically at that methane. And when it was not a problem because of the cycle of methane. So if animals are living in a natural ecosystem, there's methane is a short-lived greenhouse gas. So as opposed to CO2, which can take over 100 years to be removed from the atmosphere, methane lasts, I think, probably around closer to 10 years. And it has a high warming potential, which is problematic, which means it's actually contributing to a lot of warming, but it also has a natural process of removal. So there's a methane cycle, and it doesn't contribute to increased warming if you have a base level of livestock or ruminants, but certainly there are ways to mitigate. I think one of the metrics that we often see, though, is that the greenhouse gas emissions are not always considering how long the greenhouse gas is staying in the atmosphere. And so ruminants will get a bad rap because methane is this really warming gas, and look how much they're belching. This is problematic, but it depends on how you sort of look at the overall system. There are also a lot of innovative ways to reduce these emissions in ruminants. So feeding certain types of seaweed, other additives that can actually reduce quite a bit. And I think that's an important consideration.